So in 1897, the nationalist movement began, where 12 different Austro-Hungarian groups in Europe began to want their own states, one of which being the Jewish people of Eastern Europe, who realized that their best chance to create a new state was in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Britain was fighting in World War I. They then told the leader of the Meccan people that if his people aid the British in taking over the Ottoman Empire, that the land in Jerusalem would forever belong to the Palestinian people. However, the British also promised the Jews that after the war, they were going to be able to settle in that same Palestinian land.
And so the British divided this Palestinian land with France, as well promising the land to 3 other different peoples. And Britain tried to honor all these promises by dividing the land into a Jewish and a Palestinian state in a sort of half-to-half manner. So in 1936, the Palestinians didn't want the Israelis to keep on encroaching on their land. So they revolted again, but Britain suppressed this revolt.
And in order to make sure no further conflicts arose in the region, Britain restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine, and ensured that Palestinian land would belong to Palestinians in the coming decade. However, with World War II and the growing insecurity, globally speaking, for Jewish people, the Jewish people had to escape persecution from Hitler's genocide and went to the Israeli half of Jerusalem, increasing the population to about 30%. So by early 1940s, they began to control labor and land because they were strategically creating Jewish settlements in the area by buying land from non-Palestinian other Arab owners, as well as now being 30% of the labor. So they created a more powerful settlement. There were many minor disputes during World War II. However, it was a relatively peaceful time in the region. But in 1947, the UK realized that this was more a problem to them than actually a benefit. So they gave control to the recently founded UN as their first task. And the UN made a partition plan to evenly distribute the land to the Israelis as well as the Palestinians. However, the Palestinians weren't content with this because the British mandate that they had been promised would give them the whole land, and this infringement on their promised land led to a revolt.
And so in the second revolt, this time the Israel defeats the Palestinian forces in 1947, and they take a significantly larger part of the territory than the Palestinians had before. So it was more or less a third more than they were allowed. And so this is called the War of Independence of Israel. And after the revolt, Jordan took control of this West Bank, and Egypt took control of the Gaza territory, which left ultimately no territory for Palestine. And as a result, 700,000 Palestinians became refugees, and they were forced to move into different countries surrounding Palestine at the time.
From 1947 through to 1967, Jordan and Egypt continued to rule the two regions. Then in 1967, Palestinians had enough and revolted, but got pushed back even more, leaving already existing Israeli territory, the West Bank, Gaza, and even parts of Syria in Israeli control. In 1980 and 81, Palestine signed a treaty to reach peace where they maintained control of Gaza and the West Bank, but offered the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. In 1994, the Oslo Accords are signed following the First Intifada, and they signed another treaty, which was the 1994 Cairo Agreement, giving back Gaza and certain settlements in the West Bank back to Palestine. In 2005, there was a second uprising by Palestine where Israel became frustrated and decided to wall in the city of Gaza to prevent attacks. This led to the nation of Palestine having a split administration with two governing bodies, Palestinian National Authority and Hamas, respectively controlling settlements in the West Bank and Gaza.
Also, guys, quick correction. In 1980 and 81, it was Israel that signed a treaty, not Palestine. Apologies there. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our second episode. So today we're going to be discussing a much more controversial topic than our inaugural episode. We're going to be discussing the Israeli-Palestinian situation that is all over the media today. But before we get into anything, I want to introduce the guests that are not normally on our podcast. So first of all, we have Ale, who's going to help us moderate. She's a good friend of ours from Saudi. Me and Tariq know her really well. Say hi, Ale.
Hello. Yeah, I just want to say that I'm here as a moderator. I don't have special ties to either of the two parties, but I'm here to just learn about everything and help flow the conversation.
Thank you. And then we also have Gali, who's a who's a good friend of mine from Italy. She's Israeli, and she's going to give us the Israeli point of view. Thank you for coming, Gali.
No problem.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And then finally, we have Leen, who's a friend of ours from Saudi, and she's also Palestinian, so she's going to be sharing her views on the topic. So this should be a really fun discussion, guys. If you want to say anything, Leen.
Thank you for having me.
Of
It'll be fun.
course. Okay, Tariq, you can start the.
Okay, so the first question is kind of a broad general overview of the Palestinian or Israeli conflict, and I know that's a controversial term, but how do you guys interpret the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from your point of view?
Okay, so as I said before, I don't think using the word conflict to describe what's going on is okay or permissible, because conflict is defined as like having a distribution of the power equally among the two sides. But here we don't see that, because here we see an immense difference and an asymmetry between both sides. We see that we have Israel with, the fourth largest military, backed by the U.S. funding, backed by U.S. tax dollars, about 3.8 billion tax dollars every single year, to be exact, for the IDF. The latest weapons, most efficient training. You see them kind of be the top here, and then you have the other side, which is Palestine. And Palestine, they have no military, they have no financial aid except from the UN, and neighboring countries are only for Hamas, which is a different entity for describing that. So I think the correct word, I think the correct word you should use is probably like the abuse of power, the ongoing abuse of power, and fascism, which is fueled by the Zionist mindset. So I interpret the history as basically kind of an ongoing ethnic cleansing, a mass genocide, and a deprivation of human rights. And yeah, basically.
Well, I think the history, first of all, is pretty important to the conflicts going on even today, because as we know, there's been many conflicts. I'm sorry, I'll use the word conflict because that's just how I prefer to use it. But I think the conflict has been going on for very long, like we know since 1948, and there's the history since the beginning of Israel. And I think the conflict has been rising again and again, especially because, as you said, the different use of power and the uneven distribution of power, especially. And I think that's also, from what I regard to it, it's more that we target the terror groups, as you said, the Hamas, and less of like the Palestinian citizens and civilians. But I think, as we've seen before, the conflict is one that keeps rising again, and especially in the distribution of power, because I know Israel and Jerusalem is holy for many religions, and that usually creates the conflicts between, civilians. So.
Yeah, so I've heard, so basically I have friends from both sides. I've been on Instagram for like the past week. I've seen like the different coverages from Palestinian side of view and kind of like the Israeli also. And I think there's a clear disagreements on the cause of all these conflicts. And I think the Palestinian point of view kind of maintains that it's because of a kind of deeply rooted hatred by the Israeli government, whereas Israel's kind of pushing forward the fact that they want to, or the idea that they want to defend their citizens, and they're also mainly attacking the terror groups. And I think there's a big, mischaracterization of which is which, and it's really hard to tell because of the media's effect as well. You see some of them siding with Palestine, you see others siding with Israel. It's really difficult to tell. So I think it's really important to look at the history, and by now we will have attached like a segment about the history in the beginning of the podcast, so we kind of explain different historical conflicts. But yeah, I think it's really important to like keep discussing and understanding other people's point of views on this.
Yeah, do any of you have anything to add about this question? Okay, sure. Yeah, as Basar said, the history is very important for issues like this, and we do recognize that there are two sides to the story. And now we would love to hear if any of you have any personal experiences with the conflict or the issue, and have you or your relatives been directly affected?
Personally, I live in Israel and most of my childhood and my life. I only moved to Italy 4 years ago. So I experienced personally all the conflicts, mostly because where I used to live was usually the area targeted by the bombs that coming from the Gaza Strip. So most of my childhood, I've been, experiencing. We call it the wars. Um, so I lived through the bombs. I had to sleep in a safe space for a whole week without leaving to go to the bathroom or to get food, and because there were so many bombs and sirens that we couldn't even leave the safe space in our house. I've been driving with my family in the car, and we had a siren, and we had to stop by the side of the road and just lay flat on the ground and see the bombs flying like over our heads. Which by now, for me, it sounds funny to say, but for me, has been pretty usual experience. But when I tell to others, obviously, it's not something that's very common. But I think the fact that I lived through this, and that all my friends and family are living through this, really affects my view on it, because it hits close to home and to my heart, I guess. Especially because my dad has been a pilot in the Air Force for 25 years. So during all these operations and the wars, he's been the one who's been the closest to it. And there's always the fear of what if something happens? What if a bomb hits his plane? What if a bomb hits I know, where he's planning all these operations? And at times, obviously, there's also the what if he's, killing innocent people right now? Do I support that? Do I not support that? Like, he's my father, but he might be doing things that I don't support. So there's always that, I guess, internal conflict between my country and my values.
I think that was very well said, honestly. I can relate to that, but only on a minor level, because I consider myself a refugee, because without my American passport, I cannot enter the West Bank, because the West Bank is occupied by Israeli territory. So I'd have to pass an Israeli checkpoint, which, as we already know, that's just bad enough as it is, because I feel like this is kind of off topic, but imagine just because you're Palestinian, you have to go through your own checkpoint where most likely you'll be denied entry, or most likely you'll be denied leaving because solely of your ethnicity. So there's that. But I consider myself a refugee because I cannot enter back to Palestine without my American passport. So without it, I was forced out. Basically, not me, but like my grandparents were forced out, both sides. In 1948, they're from Tulkarm and Jenin, so they were from pretty north. So they were forced out, and then basically they fled to Jordan, where they found haven there. They were found safe. They were put in camps, actually, because of they were fled. So they were put in camps, and then they moved to Saudi. So I personally, I don't really hold any sort of as much ties as much as you do, but I do. It's like I'm Palestinian, so I'm part of the diaspora. So I live outside, so I have to watch everything from a distance and kind of just see what's happening to my country as I kind of just sit here from afar, But I want to just go back to something you said, if that's okay, about seeing the bombs, how you had to stop. You said that's kind of normal. I also think you're kind of forgetting to mention, this is not coming or to invalidate or anything, but there's two sides here. And then Gaza, for example, it's more than usual for them to be bombed by Israeli airstrikes that are dropped, on hospitals, homes, schools, to impact Gaza and to hit them where it hurts, you know what I mean? So I understand that it's usual for you, but it's also very usual for people living in Gaza, where they're deprived of basic humanitarian rights, such as water, food, for only like certain amount of times for a day. So there's both sides here, and I think people tend to forget that they kind of only look at one side and say, this is what's happening with me, but there's two sides always in every story. And I think we always have to acknowledge that when we're looking at such a sensitive topic.
I would just like to say something. I completely agree that there's two sides for every story, and especially that, I mean, people usually forget that there's two sides, and they usually stereotype or define us as, oh, you're Israeli, you're Palestinian, you guys have different views, you guys are like, they usually separate that, but they forget to acknowledge that there is two sides. I just want to go back and say that you said something about the bombs that is very usual, and I think that's like the sad truth that no one really acknowledges, that civilians are being impacted by it more than the governments themselves. Because in most cases, yes, both in Palestine and in Israel, the civilians are the ones who are getting killed. Like, I know in this current conflict, the numbers from both sides have been of just civilians and less of, the minister or, the head of the government. So I completely agree with that view.
Yeah, guys. So, I mean, really touching stories. First of all, I mean, it's really sad to hear all this from the comfort of our homes, and like we're just kind of criticizing what's going on without really living through it. And you guys have obviously very deep connections to it. But like obviously we have different questions, but I just want to address something because I don't think we really touched upon this like in the previous question. So we like different words such as like genocide and this, like a lot of different like strong words were used. So I think we need to actually like look at what for example Leen why Leen believes that this is the case, and we have to like look at the historical facts because I think we need to understand that it isn't just one side, and I think we need to understand why the historical facts might lead Leen to believe that, or why they might lead Gali to believe something else. So I want to like dive into that, and we can have some discussion about that. Hopefully, I know we have a different question, guys. To all the moderators, I'm sorry, but I think we need to address this because we use some pretty strong words there, and we need to unpack that. So, Leen, if you can explain to us why you think, and if you know the history pretty well, I'd love it if you could kind of go into the historical context and why you think that there's this oppressive state.
So, I'm pretty sure, I don't know if you guys know, but today is Nakba Day, May 15th, so like May 15th is Nakba Day, but Nakba actually occurred in May 15th, 1948, when the Israeli state was established, and where 700,000 Palestinians, my grandparents were a part of those, were displaced from their homes. They were forced out of their homes. So that in itself is ethnic cleansing. That's why I use that word. That in itself describes what ethnic cleansing is, because these people are of Palestinian origins, more specifically Arab, and they are forced out of their homes. So cleansing. So I think that describes that. Mass genocide. Let's move on to that one. I wouldn't say mass. I would just say in general, this is a genocide, because innocent civilians who don't have a military to defend themselves. I'm not speaking about Hamas. I'm speaking about Palestinians living in, say, Gaza, first of all. Or maybe the airstrikes, or attacking Al-Aqsa Mosque, whatever. That in itself is an abuse of power. They're taking advantage of having. I'm not trying to offend you guys. I'm just saying from what I've seen in the media and what I've heard from my parents, my grandparents. They've told me their stories, and it's an abuse of power. What's happening? Basically, the Israeli government, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, knows that Palestinians are weak in the sense that they do not have a government to defend themselves. So they use that in their advantage to harm and inflict violence onto Palestinians, to instill fear in Palestinians. Because I think, okay, so abuse of power falls onto the sense that Palestinians are weak, and so the Israeli government used that in their advantage. Genocide, the killing of Palestinians solely because of their, what their origins, right? So Gaza, for example, bombing, throwing airstrikes, stun grenades, gas grenades, whatever. That is an example of how it's been inflicting violence in hopes for a genocide, right? So I think those descriptions fall under those words. I don't know if there's any other word I use that you want me to describe also, but I mean, those fascism, whatever. That in itself also describes the Zionist mindset, how it believes that it's superior and it's in itself, and it wants to get rid of other unsuperior ethnicities. So they believe that if I'm Jewish, I'm superior, and that falls into the Zionist mindset and the racist mindset.
Okay. I'll let Gali speak to that soon, but I just want to, like, you mentioned the 1948 war, and I think, like, if we were to look at the historical facts, and many sources say that after the UN create a partition plan to give half the land to Jewish people, half the land to Palestinian, there are many sources claiming that Palestinians did not want to go ahead with this deal because Great Britain had a different plan for them 10 years ago, and they promised the whole land to them. And when they just gave it over to the UN and said it's half now, many sources claim that there was actually a revolt by the Palestinians. And so when the Israel, the origin of the war, I suppose is relevant to the story here, because there's a lot of sources claiming that it is actually Palestinians who started a revolt and Israelis who responded. And Gali, correct me if I've said anything wrong, or Leen, correct me if I've said anything wrong, but I've done a really specific research last night on this, and so I think that's really relevant. And kind of I don't know, you say genocide, there could be a different way to interpret that. Gali, what do you think?
I think definitely the history that you said. Obviously, we know that most conflicts are based on the distribution, or started, I guess, based on the distribution of land in Israel. Because as we know, this current conflict, from what I heard, this might be a different side of the story than what you know. Started with the whole, evacuation of Palestinian citizens from Israeli, I guess, territory in Jerusalem, which I guess later on led on to this current conflict with the involvement of the Hamas and the Israeli government and army. But I definitely think that this kind of, from what I know, started the whole thing, which again goes back to the distribution of land. I just want to go back to what Leen said earlier about the use of power. So obviously, I guess that's pretty obvious from what you said and what media shows. Yes, Israel is superior in power. I agree with that. But there's also the history of, we have been granted, or Israelis, Jewish citizens have been granted parts of Israel, and it was claimed as a Jewish country. And I know, going back to the whole evacuation of Palestinian citizens, there have been some laws behind that this property, or some houses and some properties, are actually Israeli or Jewish properties, and therefore the evacuation was, I won't say it was right, because the way it was done was really wrong in my idea, because violence was never the answer. But there is some history and some legal and I guess government laws that fall behind that. But I do think that in my, I guess, childhood, it was always referred to as, it's a war, it's a conflict. But always, yeah, as you said, Israel was superior, so it was always I guess from what I was taught, it was always the terror groups are the bad guys. I don't think we ever learned about this Palestinian citizens, just because I grew up in a very Zionist and Israeli society. But I do believe that when I talk about the conflict, I refer mostly to the Hamas or the other terror groups that are present, because I don't think Israel wants to target these Palestinian citizens. I think they want to stop the conflicts which are occurred or caused by the terror groups. And before, you said that we are targeting the civilians, but from what I know, the Hamas is hiding between civilians, and that might be wrong, and I guess that's from what I know. So you might have a different side to that story, but I know that when we bombed Palestine and the Gaza Strip, we usually aim for the terror groups and not for the citizens. And I'm not saying that we're like holy or that we don't kill citizens, because I know we do, and that's completely wrong. But I also know that the Hamas is hiding behind the citizens, and they're sacrificing their own people sometimes. So I just want to let that out, I guess.
Okay, so I'll have two things to address here. Firstly, you mentioned the houses that were, I don't know if you said this because in the beginning you were cutting off. I don't know, maybe this is my Wi-Fi, but it was something about how some homes were proven to be Israeli or something. Was that it? Okay, so yeah. So this was, do you know which time period was this?
I think she was talking about the Sheikh Jarrah thing, right?
Yeah.
Sheikh Jarrah? Okay. So the government or the Israeli Supreme Court is obviously going to hold tremendous bias towards Israelis and favor them. So in that sense, it could be false information, kind of trying to justify the fact why they're taking these homes. And also, if you, I don't know if you know this, but Sheikh Jarrah was a neighborhood that was basically Palestinians from north, from about Haifa, like Tel Aviv, but no, not Tel Aviv, but Haifa specifically. After 48, they went down to Sheikh Jarrah where there was no inhabitants, and that's when they settled. Obviously, there were some already existing settlements there and some already existing people there that were living, but the majority came from Haifa and northern cities that fell in 1948. So obviously, if you're gonna claim that, oh well, some houses were proven to be already Israeli, you have to understand that there's an Israeli Supreme Court at hand here that's obviously going to have a major favoritism towards Israelis because they obviously have that same ancestor, same language, etc. So those might be, I'm going to say those are false, obviously, because they were already living there at the time. You know what I mean? And they went down to empty houses, already living there. And then you were talking about Hamas, okay? Hamas is, you're going to say, okay, they were not targeting civilians. Most of the people killed are civilians. Airstrikes are specifically designed to launch at hospitals. You know, that when they're launched at hospitals, the people that are going to be injured are going to have nowhere to go because there's a siege. There's already borders restricting them from leaving Gaza. They can't leave. So, and they have no medical assistance or anything like that. So they're going to be left there to die from the airstrikes. And then Hamas, it doesn't target Hamas. Hamas was created. Okay, so the first Israeli airstrike was launched in, I think, 1967. Hamas was created in 1987. Okay, so when people try to use this thing saying, oh, Hamas throws airstrikes, whatever, you have to think of the time that it was created. Hamas was created as a measure of self-defense from Israeli airstrikes. It wasn't created in order to throw Israeli airstrikes without them throwing anything first. Hamas is retaliation. Hamas is basically, because Israel threw an airstrike, we're going to throw one back as a sense of, you can't take me. You know, I'm Gaza, and as in to show Gaza will not surrender that easily. Because Gaza already is suffering enough with the deprivation of food and water for only a certain amount of time. There's already that. There's already the problem with electricity there. So when Israel throws a airstrike there, bombs its hospitals, schools, homes, whatever, Hamas will retaliate by throwing one back. But now you have to understand, Israel has the Iron Dome, right? You know that, yeah? That is a very, very, extremely efficient, stopper of Hamas airstrikes. They cannot get past them. And if they do, it's a very rare minority. So the ones coming from Israel, we don't have the Iron Dome. We don't have anything to stop these airstrikes. So we're going to have way more destruction than what Israel would have. And remember, these airstrikes are used as a measure of self-defense from Israeli airstrikes. So what Hamas is trying to do here is it's to protect its people from the constant airstrikes that are being thrown on them by Israel, you know? So.
Okay. Yeah, guys, if you want to, who's got the next question? But I just wanted to add something before we move on to the next question. So I think there was some disagreement about who throws the first missiles, and Gali was saying we Israel targets civilians, and Leen was saying that Hamas is only reacting; they're not starting any of the rockets. And here's the thing, right? Especially in this conflict, like the one that the recent contemporary conflict, it's really hard to say who threw the first missed rockets. But again, depending on the source you look at, there's a lot that says Hamas threw the first rocket after the Al-Aqsa incident on May 10th. So in May 10th, basically it's Jerusalem Day, right? So I need to give this context so that the listeners understand who's throwing missiles and whatever, and explain what different sources are saying. Okay, so many Israeli media sources and some international sources were claiming that on the Jerusalem Day, May 10th, there was a parade that was set to go through Temple Mount. However, the morning of the parade, there was a conflict at Al-Aqsa Mosque where there was like many Palestinians injured, and there was a protest. So it's still controversial. Like nobody knows like what the state of the protest was. Israeli media is claiming that the Palestinian protesters began to riot and they responded. But nevertheless, that day, the problem is that that day, many sources claim that Hamas threw the first rockets in response to what happened at Al-Aqsa Mosque to the prayers. So it's like when I look at different news sources, I'm really confused because you have some international sources, Israeli sources saying Israel starts the rocket launches after Hamas has initialized, whereas like Leen said, many Palestinians are saying the exact opposite. But the problem is it's so hard to get your hands on sources that when I go on social media and I just see genocide, apart, like all these strong words, I'm like, it's really hard to deduce in my own head because I have to look at all these different media sources. And I'm trying to be objective as possible because I'm also moderating this thing. So I was trying to be as objective as possible, and it was really hard to tell who started the missile strikes. So I think media has a huge emphasis on who they want to be perceived as good and evil, and it's really hard to, especially for me, it's really hard to use strong words such as that when I don't know objectively what is happening with regards to the initialization of these conflicts. But we can go on to the next question, having said that.
Yeah, but I just want to clarify. I got the date wrong. It was not 1967. I mixed that up. It's 1981 when the first airstrike was thrown by Israel.
Oh no, yeah, I was just talking about the recent ones. I wasn't talking about the first ones. I'm not entirely sure on that. You might be right.
To go on to the next question, I also agree with Basar. Like it's so hard to understand and to distinguish between like this polarization between the problem. And I kind of wanted to ask you guys too, like personally, how do you guys distinguish between sort of the things you see on the media that are because like we all know that there's both bias for both sides all throughout media. There's two extremes to everything. So like, what do you guys think the effect of the media is like throughout this whole thing? Obviously, it's helped bring more awareness to this problem and to all the suffering on both sides. But in your cases, like, how do you think it has helped or has made the whole issue even worse?
Personally, from what I see on social media, most of the influencers or the, I guess, people I follow, even my close friends because I'm in international school, so obviously I'm not talking about the conflict with my Israeli friends because they're in Israel. So my daily life and the social media is mostly showing the side of Free Palestine and the Palestinian side, because as Leen said, usually the media tends to sympathize and empathize with this weaker side, I would call that. And in this case, it is seen that obviously Palestine and the Palestinian citizens have less rights and less, I guess, support than what they should have, and it shows the unequal treatment, obviously. But when I go into social media or when I scroll through Instagram, all I see is influencers like Bella Hadid and Gigi Hadid posting about Free Palestine and how terrible Israel is. And I'm not saying that Israel hasn't done bad things, because, as we said earlier, I think the evacuation of the houses and the bombs are never the solution. But I also, as an Israeli citizen, it breaks my heart to see that we're treated as the bad guy, when, in my understanding, we're just defending ourselves. Like Leen said, I think each country is trying to defend themselves, and the media sometimes takes it out of context, especially with the facts, because it's really hard to decide who started the bombs first, or who has the right to do this and to do that. But even like my close friends in my school, they're posting about Israel has been doing bad things, and they've killed millions of citizens. And from my side point of view, that's not the things that I see happening from my friends or from the family, or in my own eyes. Even, like, I know that we're trying to defend ourselves, and that we're going through the same experiences of citizens, I guess, attacks. But the media shows something completely different, and sometimes that really, I guess, hurts to see or to watch. So.
Okay, Gali, so you said defend, right? So I don't know why a state with the fourth largest military in the world would need to defend themselves from one with no army. Like, why do you need to? This is just referring to the Al-Aqsa Mosque attack. Why did Israel feel the need to attack 300 worshippers praying in the holiest month of the year, on the holiest day, Laylat al-Qadr? Why did they feel the need to attack, Palestinians on that day, when they said, oh, they were collecting rocks? Okay, rocks, like, they have stun grenades, they have gas grenades, they literally have guns, weapons. They're funded by the U.S. obviously, and I know that, and I think you know that too. So with this $3.8 billion financial budget, I don't really think it's defending. I think it's persecute. I think it's ethnic cleansing and inflicted violence. Yeah, that's what I think it is. I think, because why would Israel need to defend themselves from young civilians that are like 7 years old? The nine Palestinian kids that were killed in Gaza and Gaza. I don't think that's defense. I think that shouldn't be defined as defense. I think that there's another definition for that. And I don't, when people say, oh, this is Israel defending themselves, if it's defense, if it's really self-defense, then why would they need they already have the fourth largest military, when my people don't have any military. Okay, like, they have airstrikes, but those are used as self-defense, right? So I'm gonna go back to Alejandra's question, which was media. So from what I've noticed is that obviously Israel has major diplomatic ties with Western media, specifically in the U.S., as the U.S. and Israel are financially and diplomatically tied together. So there's obviously that. So I think with their diplomatic ties and with their alliances and whatever, and there's obviously going to be some sort of push in their favor in media outlook. So that's why you always see in Western media, you find people posting about, oh, Israel is not that bad. Oh, Israel, what they're doing is justifiable. But then in the Arab world, as you mentioned, you live in the Arab world in Israel. So you're going to find people with common shared ancestry between, for example, I am Arab. So I'm going to expect the Arab media news to write something that's in favor of me, that's supporting me, that makes me seem like the victim. So there's that kind of, it depends on how you look at it and what ties those people have, or what kind of similarities they have to one another. So it depends on that sense. So the only reason that in Arab world I am portrayed, even though there are any incidents where Palestinians are the victims, blah, 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 the common shared ancestry between me and my neighboring countries are obviously going to promote that viewpoint and perspective.
All right, I'm just going to jump in here. So I just have a question for you. So it's clear here that a lot of you guys who are following and followed by Palestinians or people in the Middle East have very biased towards the Palestinian side viewpoint through Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and such. And on the opposite side, those who are, surrounded by American or Israeli or countries that support Israeli, those types of people who are followed or follow those people have the opposite problem. I'm just wondering, what would you recommend? It's clear that TikTok and Instagram are very divisive. This has always been known. I would compare it to, like, you guys know how like the left and the right wings are so far apart in like the United States, between like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, right? And Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The right and the left is just so far apart. And what the problem is, I think I just want to add on, I know that there's a lot of misinformation, but Instagram and TikTok, they want to get you hooked, Their main idea is to get increased views, to increase time spent on the app. And what they want to do is, if you're someone who likes a lot of Palestinian posts, they're going to keep reiterating those posts and re-showing you more people who agree with you, so that you keep liking and keep commenting and get addicted to the app, because that's what social media does. That's how they make their money, right? And on the opposite side, if you like a few Israeli posts or you follow a few people who like them, it'll start completely, surrounding you in the Israeli media, and to further reaffirm your beliefs, And I think that's the same thing that's happening with the liberal and conservative, like, huge split, worse than it's ever been before. So I would just ask you guys, what do you think is the most unbiased, or some unbiased ways to gather information on the topic? Do you think things like the UN or the World Health Organization or any countries provide an unbiased, informative media on the topic?
Guys, if I could just, go ahead. You can go ahead.
I honestly think that in order to avoid bias, we must show both sides of the story. Obviously, some things that I heard from Leen I haven't heard before, just because what I usually read are the Israeli news. It's so hard, like Basar said as well, it's so hard to find valuable resources to get the right information from. So definitely showing both sides of the story, or hearing from different point of views, will, I guess, decrease the bias. I don't think we can completely erase the bias, but at least decrease it. But for example, like Leen said about the attacks in the mosque of the Israeli defensive forces, and from your point of view, that sounds like a very unethical thing. And I'm not saying it's not; it really is unethical. But from what I heard is that there has been the violent protest before that, and the collection of rocks. I forgot the word you said. I'm sorry. But the rocks that they used, that was that was the day after was the Holy Jerusalem Day for us, which is a really, like, a holiday for us, just like the day before was a holiday for you guys. And I know that there has been a shooting of rocks from the mosque that's, like, basically on top of the Western Wall, that thousands of Jewish citizens were praying, and because it was a holiday. And I don't know who started, and it's not my point, or like my place to say who started and who's wrong and who's right. I'm just saying that, as you see, like, there's like two sides to the story, because I didn't know about your side, and I don't know if you knew about my side. But that's what social media does. It literally divides us and shows us only one side of the story and not both sides. Because if I would have known your side, my view would have been different than what it is now.
Okay, guys. So if I may add, okay, so I was doing a lot of research for this discussion, obviously, and I had to go to, like, direct sources in order to get the most unfiltered information, which is quite difficult to do. But you have to go to, like, directly to Israeli sources. I was reading the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel yesterday. You have to go to Palestinian sources, which is a lot harder to find, like Palestinian media sources. But then you can go to, like, different media sources that kind of are with Palestine, like Al Jazeera kind of tends to side with Palestine, different sources like that. But yeah, you guys were talking about the Al-Aqsa situation, and I think it's a good segue to kind of talk about the start of the conflict, like the current conflict, because here's my understanding of it, right? So when I was reading the Israeli media, they said that there's a lot more that's going into this than just Sheikh Jarrah, which is what I've been seeing from people who've been supporting Palestine. For example, the Israeli media have been saying that there's a coordinated rioting that the Palestinian officials are trying to kind of execute in Israel, because the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, have canceled the elections, and they claim that it's because they're afraid of losing to Hamas. And so Hamas, in reaction, is trying to start riots within Jerusalem to kind of offset that cancellation of elections. And moreover, I've also heard that the Hezbollah forces, which are another jihadist group, they've also said the IDF is as weak as it's ever been. This is the time to kind of take action. And then Iran has made certain claims such as Palestine has to be the axis of jihadism. So what I've been hearing from the Israeli media is that there was very high tensions during the time due to different statements made from different groups that were threatening Israel. And so that's why they had to take extra measures during the month of Ramadan. Also, there's a lot of controversy on the state of the protests / riots. Like, for example, the protests on May 8th in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was like the first kind of siege of the mosque, I suppose, where the Israeli sources are saying there was fireworks within the mosque that were being set off, and there were rocks being thrown on the police. So it's I think it's a good segue to kind of talk about the causations. I think you two will have vastly different opinions of those. Okay, guys, if somebody wants to elaborate.
Yeah, what was the question?
So the question is, what do you think the causation of the current conflicts is? And I've mentioned some of the Israeli media and what they've been saying. What do you think it is? And I'll ask the same thing to Gali.
In Al-Aqsa?
In general, like the Sheikh Jarrah, Al-Aqsa, and then there's other.
Oh, in general.
Like
okay.
The current one.
Okay. Now, that question, it's very loaded, because the causation of the problems go back, like biblically. Okay, they go back very far back, because it's the whole claim. Okay, so from what I've done, I've read bits of the Torah, just bits of it, but what I've seen and what I've heard from like rabbis in general is that the justification for the annexation of Palestinian land and the building on illegal territory is that God, I forgot the name, but God gave me this land as a Jew. So they believe that I'm not 100% positive, but is that the land was allotted to them by their God. So that's how they justify it. So that's how it goes back biblically. But if you're talking now, I mean, that it leads up to that with that whole like biblically segment. Like it's I think people try to like distance themselves from calling it a religious conflict, but I think religion does play a big factor in the whole ongoing abuse of power, because with how like Israel views, they view their possession on the land as justifiable because their religion permits it. But then you have the ongoing persecution of Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians. As though I think Israel tries to refrain from calling it a religious conflict, because I feel like if that does happen, then there'll be a lot of backlash to Israel. But the difference that Palestinian Muslims receive on a day-to-day basis is extremely worse than Palestinian Christians, because Palestinian Muslims are like my family, this is person, but my family is half Christian, half Muslim, like on my dad's side, and I have relatives. So on the residency card, it kind of says what your religion is, the Palestinian one. And when you're going through Israeli checkpoints, the treatment you receive is much, much more different than how a Palestinian Christian would receive. You know what I mean? So there is that embedded religious conflict inside both Muslims and Jewish and Christian people.
Could I just say something really quick about what you said, Leen? So you said that like religion does take a large role in this whole problem. I like from what I've researched and everything. Like to what extent like is it a land issue, because fundamentally they're fighting about land and about who has this God-given right, right? Because there's Palestinian Jews, there's Palestinian Catholics, Muslims, but there's also Muslim Israelis and obviously Jewish Israelis. So like how do you sort of distinguish between what is the actual like root of the problem? Like I know you can't really categorize what you said. It's like a loaded question because there's decades full of history, decades full of things that have happened. But like if you had to sort of put religion and land together, like you said, it has a lot to do. Like religion has a lot of importance to this, but I don't know. What do you think, Gali?
I think it's definitely hard, like you said, to distinguish between the two, because we usually tend to forget that they're separate things. From what I know, or from what I believe, the issue started as land distribution, and later on escalated into, I guess, more racism, I guess, towards different religions that live in Israel or that live in Palestine. But I think it's more of a. I think it's honestly hard to like define what the conflict is about, because it can be about land for sure, like we see from distribution, going back to the history of the establishment of Israel, the evacuation of citizens from different parts of Israel. So that's mostly land, but then people tend to justify it as, oh no, like in Israel, I know they justify it, oh no, they're Muslims, or they don't deserve to live in Israel, which that's a very radical point of view that I don't think we should, get into that, because I don't support that kind of view. But they tend to use religion as like back up, or like like they use religion to justify their actions. That's what I'm trying to say, basically.
Yeah, also from what I've seen, I like from my research, I tend to think it's more ethnic based than religion based, for the sole purpose that before the land was kind of Israeli or Palestinian, it was under the Ottoman Empire, and all three religions lived in peace back then. There was no conflicts, nothing. And there was, people reading the Torah, the Quran, the Bible. Everybody was kind of in like this communal space. And I think when the problem really arose was when Ottoman Empire fell, and then Great Britain tried to kind of take responsibility of giving it to these different races, and they kind of created like a jigsaw puzzle of the region. We're going to give this to Palestine, this to Israel and whatnot. And I think a lot of it has to do with their inability to rationally govern the state during those like 30 years of almost chaos, from like 1917, end of World War I, to 1947 with the UN partition plan. Like during those 30 years, there's absolute chaos because of the Great Britain's inability to govern and be respectful of the different ethnicities, I think.
Yeah, Bashar.
Yeah, I think what you're referring.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I just wanted to say like. Oh, my bad. Leen, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say what he's referring to is the British Mandate, and how it was used to sort of aid the Palestinians after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire fell, because Ottoman Empire was like taking care of helping them economically, diplomatically, with their military, whatever. So when they fell, the Palestinians were very vulnerable. And so Britain saw that and took that. And so then they applied the British Mandate, whatever. And so I think also I want to just touch upon this really quickly. I think when Britain took off their mandate, and then they kind of did Sykes-Picot and the Sykes-Picot, there was another agreement, and they did that one where they allotted the land to Jews. That when taking off the British mandate, when the British mandate was taken off, Palestinians were also very vulnerable because they had sort of dependency on Britain, and beforehand they had this dependency on the Ottoman Empire. So when the British mandate was removed, Palestinians were very, very vulnerable and like without any defense. So Jews coming into the land was very easy for them to take and make the 1948 would happen.
Yeah, Leen, I was just wondering, that's a great point, Basar and Leen. We haven't brought it up too much, but I was just wondering, do most Israelis and Palestinians both agree about the British's wrongdoings and promising land and making false promises that they would later not follow through, and actually giving a portion of that land to France, even though they're not really involved? Like, do you guys come to a common understanding on the British's lies and kind of manipulation of both Palestine and Israel?
I think, well, usually in like school or like geography classes or history classes, they're not talking about that mostly, just because that's not in the program, I guess, or that's not what they want us to know, which I guess makes me kind of biased about this question for sure. But I think that, yeah, I think the initial distribution of land to Israel, going back to 1948, I know that before then there has been lots of, I guess, false promises and I guess unjustifiable promises or sayings from both sides. I know the British for sure, but I think because, and that's kind of like where it all falls apart, because the Jewish has been getting more land than the Muslims or Palestinians have been promised, and that created lots of conflicts. But we take it as, oh, we got land, we don't care. Like, that's the view that Israel takes for that. But I definitely think that we acknowledge that there has been false promises or that there have been lies, for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree, Gali. Yeah, I think with the Balfour Declaration and like the promise of Palestinians to have their own land in the end, with the like lying, they just lied and said, oh well, you know what, instead of letting you have your own land, we're going to give you this land to Jews, and then therefore like things escalated and whatever, and then obviously Palestine fell, etc., etc. But I think, yeah, definitely, I think there's some sort of common like hatred towards the British mandate on both sides, because the British mandate was in place to allow Palestinians to, after it being removed, to allow them to live as a sovereign state, basically. So that's why the whole thing was put in place. But after Britain went behind Palestinians' back and went to the Jews and created the Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot, whatever, that whole thing in itself was kind of plotted, knowing that the Palestinians were very vulnerable at the time. So yeah, I think there's this common hatred towards British, but obviously I think Israelis have more, less hatred, because this is in their favor, you know what I mean? So I think there's that thing.
I think just to sort of add on to what you were saying, Leen, yeah, like I agree. There was like an inability of Britain to sort of govern this power, and so given that, the reason, like the way that I view it, was how they sort of gave this land, obviously, to the Jewish, who were suffering both after World War I and World War II, and so given that when they sort of gave this role to the Jewish people to like allow them to move in, the Palestinians were kind of they were lenient with it, because they themselves were not fully governed, like they didn't have a government themselves after World War I. And so for this matter, I think that's why it was like a hidden problem, because it was first like the first couple of settlements, Jewish settlements, and then like they couldn't sort of really make a name out of themselves, the country themselves. So I think it moves on to our next question about like, what are your personal thoughts about some solutions? Because given that there's like Palestine itself doesn't have a centralized government, and Israel is supported by all these Western nations, like how could there be a one state or two state decisions or any possible solutions? I don't know if you guys have some recommendations.
So I think that question is like very complicated to think about, specifically now with everything going on, especially in Sheikh Jarrah, and all of Palestine in general. But one thing I know is that a one-state solution cannot be achieved, given the fact that there is a huge difference. There's a clear and evident difference between Israelis and Palestinians in terms of power, right? So if you're thinking one state, the power will not be distributed among everyone equally. It just won't happen, because people don't work that way. People, like, it's in human nature to kind of want to maintain your superiority over someone else, right? So that's ingrained in people in general. But I think if we were to achieve some solutions other than, I would lean more towards the two-state solution. But I think, first of all, the Gaza siege has to be lifted. That's like without question, because Gaza currently is undergoing a deprivation of basic human and natural rights. I think that's very evident. I think people know that. And staying silent about it also just hurts people more. But I think a two-state solution is more necessary and more viable than a one-state solution, because a two-state solution, it allows Palestinians and Israelis to live in their own communities without the fear of doing something again like 1948, right? It kind of creates one's own sovereign nation. But if a two-state solution can be achieved, I think Israel would have to abound by these set boundaries and by these set lines that differ, that say, okay, this is Palestine, this is Israel. Because for example, the wall built in Jerusalem, the wall built in West Bank, it doesn't abide by the set boundary that was established by international law. It actually moved in more, so it limited Palestinian space, so it shrunk the West Bank tremendously, right? So that's that. And so what's it called? Yeah, I think a two-state solution can be achieved, but Israel and Palestinians as well. But I don't think Palestinians can really do much, given their military status, given their economic status, which is already bad enough. But they can't really do much. So I think it's up to Israel to fulfill its promises of being able to withstand the boundaries that will be, hopefully will be set, to allow them both to live in their own separate sovereign nations. I think that's the best case.
Yeah, guys, I don't know why I just clapped. That was an accident. Sorry about that. But yeah, I think when I hear about the two-state solution, the only problem that comes to my mind is, like, historically speaking, there's a serious inability from both sides to, like, accept whatever plan a person in Europe has set for them. Like, the UN just gets together and says, this is your land. And then, like we saw in 1947, Palestine wasn't really happy with that because of the British mandate that was given to them before. And so they weren't happy with that. And then obviously the 1967 situation and the 6 Days War, there was a problem with the partitioning there. So the only problem that comes into my mind with the two-state solution is, I think it has to be a consensus between Israel and Palestine, which it seems extremely difficult to imagine right now, because I assume both parties think that they are entitled to a certain amount of land, and it would be fairly difficult. But as far as the one-state solution, I don't think either party would just accept being under the name of the other party. It would have to be some kind of, I don't know, and that would have problems with, like, I don't know. It's really hard to come up with any solutions in this situation because of the clear ethnical divide. Like, if you were to say one-state solution, is it going to be called Israel? Is it going to be called Palestine? Is it going to be called, I don't know. It's, like, really hard to come up with. And the two-state solution, same thing. The partitioning is really difficult to do. But I hope there is hope. Like, if we keep talking about it like this, we bring Israelis and Palestinians together to talk, I think that we could make progress in that sense. But yeah, hopefully a bright future in that sense.
For sure, yeah.
With like questioning, that's okay. Just like a small thing. So I obviously, my point of view is that violence is never the answer. I really think that we need to come to a solution that doesn't involve any violence from both sides, because that's just wrong, in my opinion. And of course, there's many different sides in Israel, and I believe even in Palestine. But my point of view is that we need and we could and we should live in like harmony. Like I don't think that there's obviously like the very violent and radical points of views. Um, from my point of view, I think one state solution should be ideal. Like we should be able to live in harmony, but obviously that is very much magical and like fairy tale like, and in reality that probably wouldn't happen. But I definitely believe that the both Israeli and Palestinian civilians deserve and should have the same rights. I don't think one should be superior over the other. Um, and like Leen said, right now Israel has a strong military, yes, and Palestinian citizens do not have that. I guess what you could call it privilege to have the government or a strong army, and that should be equal. I believe in both. In no matter what the solution is, I think we should be on equal terms and equal treatment. But again, like I think one big misconception is that the military is strong and big, and in reality, most of the military is composed of 18 years olds because military is mandatory. So, for example, I will be going to the military in like 3 months, and I don't want to be in the military when conflicts are happening and when I have to go and fight and defend and I say defend because that's how I say it, but I know there's different point of views, and defend my country. Like at the end of the day, I'm just an 18-year-old girl. Like, why do I need to fight for like peace? That should be something that we need to find a solution for. Basically, that's what I'm saying. But it shouldn't be violent for sure.
Yeah, I think at this point we all hope for a long-term peaceful solution, and I think collaboration is a strong part of that. And now we've talked about the history of it, the current issues, and we've even talked about some future solutions. So I kind of want to bring it back to some of the media criticism of both Israel and Palestine's actions in this current issue. And I was wondering, do you think this is a reflection of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, or is the criticism just a critique of the government's irrespective of religion or ethnicity?
I think the criticism is not based on anti-Semitism because, so first of all, okay, Semitism is defined as languages that originate from Aramaic, right? Which is, I'm going to go a bit off topic because people tend to overlook this. And even though it's not used in everyday context, it's still very important to remember. But Semitism is defined any language originates from Aramaic, which is the language spoken during Jesus Christ's time. And any language basically that the mother language is Aramaic. So Hebrew is one and Arabic is one, okay? So if you're saying Semitic, you're also including more specifically Palestinians because they are indigenous to the land and speak the language. So this may be a bit controversial, but I've talked to one of my teachers about it, and he was like, yeah, this is true. The Arabs are considered Semitic, but not an everyday language. But based on that definition, then technically it can't be like anti-Semitic because most Arabs are Semitic, right? But I don't think it's criticism on. I don't think it's some first. Okay, for Western media, it definitely has a lot to do with Islamophobia. Definitely because that is very ingrained in Western media society to uphold the sort of view that Muslims are bad. So anything they do is related to terrorism. So we must kind of incorporate this Islamophobia in our media to allow it to kind of spread and get more people, right? There's that. But I don't think it relates to Semitism. when speaking, like when criticizing Jews, because when something's criticizing Jews, there tends to be like some like video evidence or some photographic evidence of actually what's happening, right? With most of the Palestinian things you see in Western media that are criticizing Palestinians, tends to kind of revolve around Hamas, which is an Islamic, terrorist, Islamic extremist group, right? But when you see anything revolving around Israel, you kind of see the violent attacks that are being done. So I don't think it revolves around Semitism. I think more it revolves on Islamophobia.
Yeah, but Leen, here's the problem with that. When you said that the criticism on Palestinians are usually because of the doings of Hamas, but I see the same thing with Jewish people. There's a lot of prejudice against Israelis because of what the IDF is doing, and they have no control over that. Oftentimes, they're not even a part of that, and they're just regular citizens, and they have to live with this. I don't know this. At least in some media, they have to live with this portrayal that they're kind of like evil people and that they're trying to steal Palestine's humanity and stuff like that, when a lot of them aren't even directly affiliated with the IDF. So I think it goes both ways. I think you're completely right about the fact that Palestinians are being kind of limited to what Hamas is doing, but also you have to see the opposite side, where I think Israelis are often being limited to what the IDF is doing, and that they have little to no affiliation with that. So I think there's definitely some prejudice with regards to Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But I think when you criticize the governments themselves, I don't think that is Islamophobic or anti-Semitic. Like when somebody criticizes the Israeli government, I don't think that's an inherent attack on Jewish people. And when somebody criticizes the Palestinian officials, I don't think that's an inherent attack on Islam or what Islam stands for. So I think there has to be a fine line driven between the government affiliation and then the citizens and what they have in terms of being affiliated with the conflicts. And maybe that's not being done very well right now, but I certainly see some improvement with regards to that from past coverages of the Palestinian-Israeli conflicts.
Yeah, Basar, I completely agree. I think that's just like my own media bias that kind of portrayed that to me, that making me think that, oh, it's just, the Jews themselves. But obviously IDF has a lot to play in this. But then again, maybe this is my own media bias, but don't most Jews, I'm asking you because you are Israeli, and I'm genuinely wondering, don't most Jews support the acts of the IDF, or is that just because I have a Jewish friend and she says her family completely supports what the IDF does. Maybe it supports because there is media bias there, so then they tend to overlook what's actually happening, or are you guys fully aware of what the IDF does? And if you are, do you support it fully?
Well, okay, that's a very tricky question for sure. Because obviously, I want to support, and many of my family and friends, we support, Israel and the IDF, because that has been just I guess not forced, but that has been part of our society and culture for many years now. And I mean, everyone goes to the IDF, it's mandatory, as I said, I will be going soon. But I do think that sometimes the media fails to show, I'm not going to say the good sides, but the less terrible, I guess you can say, sides of the IDF. Because of course the media sometimes shows the really terrible things that the IDF is doing. But I think that in many places we're also trying to do our best in the current situations. I don't think anyone wants to go to a war and fight, and no one wants to sacrifice their lives for this, I want to say, stupid conflict, because it really is stupid that we're using violence to solve this and not, other solutions. But personally, I support the IDF because that's what I've been taught my entire life, and that's, like you said, that's my personal bias in there. But I do think that some things of the IDF that we're doing are actually justifiable, because we are really trying our best. I'm not going to say that we're holy. I'm not going to say that everything we do is justifiable. But I know some things that we're doing, we're trying to do the best that we can with the situation. So
so you support the idea, but the actions that they do, such as like, violently harassing peaceful protesters, people just holding signs, like that to me is sort of, I don't think it's justifiable when people are peacefully, sure, okay, what about peacefully praying in the mosque, or what about the attack in the during Easter on the church? Like, if people are just peacefully praying or just in their homes doing nothing, I don't think, I mean, yeah, there is obviously, I understand your bias, because I do have bias too. I do have bias too, obviously. It is obviously ingrained in me because I do come from Palestinian descent, meaning like my family has this bias and I think your family has too, obviously. So, but like, if you look at the idea from like a view of both sides, you'll see that like there are some acts that I don't think can be justifiable or can be deemed okay, right? There's obviously the bombing of Al-Aqsa. This is not the IDF, but the Aqsa, there was a fire, and I don't know if you saw it, but it was on Jerusalem Day or something, and there was a fire, and Jewish people were just like, Israelis were just dancing, like watching. Have you heard about that?
I actually haven't heard about that, no. I think that's like part of my media bias, as you said.
Yeah, guys, I think media bias does play a huge role in it because like I have seen both of it, like, because I've done really extensive research. I've seen like the fire that Leen is talking about with the tree near Al-Aqsa Mosque, and you have like a bunch of Jews chanting like slurs and stuff. But then I've also seen certain videos where like certain Palestinians have gathered and saying like bomb Tel Aviv and stuff. Like, I mean, it really depends on what you're exposed to, and depending on what you're exposed to, you can have vastly different ideas on the topic. And yeah, so I think media coverage has to be better in this sense. But I think that was the last question, unless anybody else has anything to add to the kind of discussion. We're kind of done with the podcast. But in conclusion, yeah, Ali, I think you were going to say something. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I just wanted to sort of just thank you for everything, for everyone. I know a lot of the information that you guys shared was really personal, especially with your own experiences when you were little and just in general. But I found this really informative, and just in general, like sitting down to talk with both sides here, it's such a valuable experience that I don't think many people have the opportunity to do that because, like they don't have friends like this, and they don't have the open-mindedness to do this. So I think it was really good. Like, thanks.
Yeah, we've all learned a lot from this, and thank you so much for being willing to put your opinions forward on such a sensitive topic. I think it's very courageous, and sorry about all the things you experiences, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you guys. I think it was very enlightening to hear someone else's side, because usually I only know my side and hear my friends talk about it, and seeing the different side is usually really hard for me. So this was very, very educating. Thank you.
Our pleasure, guys. This is why we created the podcast to begin with. We want to create a platform where we can have different people talking about it, and I think we've realized that there has to be an effort made on both sides to collaborate and really have these dialogues that we're trying to promote on this podcast in order to better the situation. But yeah, guys, thanks for coming. Especially thanks to our guests for coming. This has been an extremely good episode. And I have to mention something before we end the episode. I want you guys to subscribe, like, and comment, but I don't want any kind of negative comments towards any of our guests, because they've actually shown a significant amount of courage to come on this podcast, share all these personal stories. So if I see any like derogatory comments, I'm not going to be happy with that. And I think we're going to make sure that is not going to be a problem. We might even ban people if that's the case. So please keep it respectful, because it takes a lot of courage to come on here. And once again, thank you, everybody. And I think this has been an extremely good episode. Peace.